All right, we're back. Hold on, I'm creating a poll. Up with the music. It's a bit much. All right, there you go. We'll let the poll run for about 5 minutes. Everybody gets a vote. It's anonymous. I don't see who votes. If you want to help determine what game we're going to play.
Spent a bloody fortune, actually, and when the evening of the 28th came around, I'll admit to having an embarrassing amount of fun. Giving out the sweets was one thing, but it also gave me a great opportunity to meet some of my near and distant neighbors. I've always been something of an introvert, so I was never about to go knocking from door to introduce myself. But having them come to me in a really fun, relaxed environment was just wonderful. I'm sorry to bang on about how superb my life was, but you need to understand that I went from an all-time high to an all-time low in the space of about 72 hours, and my whole life came crumbling down with one little knock on my door. So, like I said, Halloween in 2007 fell on a Wednesday, and since there had been that big supervised trick-or-treating thing on that Sunday, I thought that I'd only get a handful of trick-or-treaters at most. Between about 5 and 9 p.m., I only had about 4 knocks at the door, all from kids a little bit too old for the supervised walk-around. I'd made sure to keep some sweets left over, and I was very generous with them, especially with the last couple of groups. I didn't want a ton of sugary sweets around the house, as putting on a load of weight wasn't exactly how I wanted the next new chapter of my life to start. The last group, which called just before 9, got a massive share of sweets, and I only kept a few bits of pieces for myself to have after my tea. And then, at about 9:30, I get yet another knock at the door. I remember being just a teensy bit miffed that someone was calling so late, but I also felt a tiny bit guilty for not having kept any sweets for them, so when I opened the door, I was really dreading the prospect of disappointing a bunch of excited but late corner kids. But then when I opened the door to see who it was, there was only one teenage-looking kid, not in costume, standing in the middle of my path. Before I could get a word out, he said, "Trick or treat," with this smug little grin etched on his face, and I looked over his shoulder to see a gang of his mates trying to hide behind the hedges which separated the front yard from the street. Having gotten an immediate bad vibe from the kid and his mates, I was almost pleased to have to tell them that I was out of sweets. You could tell that they were just taking the mickey, like it wasn't just me being a knobhead and trying to be the costume police. If they'd have asked nicely, even without costumes, I'd never have turned them down if I had stuff to spare. But since there was obviously some ulterior motive, I quite sternly told them that they were out of luck. I expected an egg or two to fly my way after that, maybe an open bag of flour or something, but instead of just flinging something and legging it, the boy on my pathway spoke up again. He said something like, "Well, you gotta give us something. Otherwise you're getting the trick, aren't you?" At that, I remember saying, "Yeah, trick away then, lads. You were never getting anything asking like that anyway." I knew that they were going to react badly, and I was more than prepared to give them a good old chase if they decided to throw anything at my new castle. It'd be an inconvenience, yes, but I'm not having some little toe rag talking to me like that on my own friggin' doorstep. And like I said, I expected them to throw something. What I didn't expect was the main offender to walk up my pathway and spit a huge gob of saliva right at me. To the little ratbag's credit, he was impressively accurate with his shot, and then when I jumped off the porch to chase them down, they legged it like the little bellends that they were. And I stopped chasing them as soon as I got to the end of the path, and I did so for 3 reasons. Number 1, I'm not the type of bloke to smack a kid around, so there was no point chasing them. And number 2, I'd just been spat on, so the primary thought in my mind was, get this off of me right now. And number 3, I'd bought and installed a little security camera just a few weeks before, a little security camera that was about to pay for itself. So I go inside, and I know this is disgusting, so cover your ears if you're squeamish or whatever, but I scooped the lad's phlegm off of me with a teaspoon, and then put it in a teacup that I swore never to drink from again. The idea was to get his DNA, which would be in saliva because, again, there was no way that I was letting some little gob spit on me and get away with it. I then carefully took off the pants that I'd been wearing, threw them in the wash, and then ran to my laptop to check the camera footage. Back then, the quality wasn't great and all the footage was stored online, not on an app, so it took an irritating amount of time to lock down the moment the incident actually occurred. And it was a real pain in the butt, but I did manage it in the end, and with the footage that I secured, I was quite certain that I was going to have that little bugger in handcuffs by the end of the week. I had to download the portion of the video stream I wanted and then save it as a video file, and then once I had that done, I could call the police. And the experience was a bit of a snakes and ladders, if I'm being honest. The woman I spoke to was great, and she assured me that the officers would stop by at some point to take a statement and review the footage. The downside was that because it wasn't an ongoing incident, and I basically had the kid banged to rights having put his spit in a mug, it wasn't going to be a priority incident on a night when there's statistically tons of other crime. That's true, by the way. If you live in a city larger than about 100,000 people, crime is said to jump up anywhere between 17 to 34%, depending on where you live. I suppose that's what happens when you dedicated an entire night to all things frightening. But anyway, as I was saying, I got my report filed, and then I was making myself a cup of tea, still in my undies, when there was a loud, heavy knocking on my front door. I ran to put on some pants, shouting that I'd be there in a minute, and in my rush to grab something dry from a clothes horse, I picked up a pair of short, silky gym shorts that covered me up, but definitely made me look a bit odd. Not that it mattered, it would only be the police knocking round a bit earlier than expected. Well, that's what I thought anyway, and I thought wrong. When I opened the door, there was a complete stranger on the doorstep. He looked to be in his 40s or 50s with his leathery Nana's handbag-looking tan that gave away a decade or two of Spanish summers. He wore a fleece, a baseball cap, and a pair of battered old trainers, and as much as I'm embarrassed to admit, my opening line was a very confused one. "Are you with the police?" And he shook his head. "No, mate. I'm not with the police." He said those last three words with a sort of weird mocking tone. "But they should be round here, shouldn't they? Looking for you." I remember being extremely confused because when he said, "looking for you," he was right. The police should have been on their way around, so I just couldn't quite work out what he was getting at. I sort of rewound the conversation a bit, then asked him why he was there, and again, he returns with this really cryptic response. "You tell me, mate," he says, getting more aggressive. "It's you that's going around nuncing kids." I didn't take that accusation seriously at first. It came that far out of left field. But for any of you American readers, I should probably take the time to explain. A nunce is a British slang term stemming from the acronym given to those who'd committed indecent offenses towards children, for lack of better words. It stands for not on normal courtyard exercise.
If you haven't seen this
Because
game,
if these
there's a lot
blokes
of
were
bug
allowed to mix
killing,
with their fellow
so-
prisoners during yard time, they'd end up with their heads caved in. It's a bit like calling someone a predator over in the US, and quite obviously it's a very serious accusation to level at someone. But like I mentioned, I was so taken aback by the whole suddenness of the encounter that the accusation did very little but confuse me. So when the bloke on my doorstep mentions the whole nunce thing, and I had no idea what he was talking about, but then as he started to get less and less cryptic, I realized that it wasn't just a throwaway insult. It was a very serious accusation. I asked him what he was talking about, and that's when he mentions, and I quote, 4 young lads who just called here for trick-or-treating." Obviously, I'm still furious at being spat on, so I immediately reply with something like, "Oh yeah, the ones who've been around spitting at me?" And the bloke then basically takes this as an admission and starts saying, "Oh, so you admit it then? You tried to touch my lad, did you?" And I only made the connection in that moment, right as the bloke lunged at me. I barely got the front door shut in time, and I remember sinking down and leaning up against it to keep it closed as the guy outside kept slamming his fist into the wood. He was shouting all kinds of horrible things, and I wasn't really listening. My brain was just completely focused on the fact that this little monster who spat at me had actually gone home and then told his dad or uncle or whoever that is that I was some predator who's tried to, I don't know, drag his kid into my house or something. And hearing this furious guy screaming and banging on my door was obviously very scary, but I had the spit, I had the camera footage, I had everything to prove that I wasn't lying about the sequence of events. The kid was obviously just trying to get himself out of trouble before it found him first, but since he didn't have a leg to stand on, I honestly wasn't too worried about the sudden turn of events. Worried for my bloody door frame, yes, but not much else. I stayed there for a while, propped against the door, wondering if I should go and arm myself with something just in case this guy was mental enough to break in. But in the end, he seemed to get bored, then, after shouting something about coming back with more people to string me up or whatever he said, I heard the telltale sound of my garden gate opening and closing, meaning he'd walked off and left. First thing I did was call the police again, obviously with a much more urgent incident to report, and after that, 2 officers arrived within the hour. They spent a good 45 minutes talking the whole thing out with me, and obviously I showed them the CCTV footage of me getting spat on to give some context. One of the officers even had a little DNA swab, and he took a sample of the lad's spit, just as I'd hoped they would. It was a horrible situation, but I thought it was pretty much over. My only fear was that the bloke might convince a bunch of his boozed-up mates to come round the next night and throw a brick through my window, but if that did happen, the police officers assured me that they'd shoot round if I called 999 in the event of that happening. And after they left, I had a cup of tea to calm my nerves a bit and watched the last hour of whatever scary Channel 4 movie was showing and then went to bed. The next morning, I woke up feeling fresh, but instantly remembered the events of the night before. I ran to the top of the stairs and saw no damage to the door, and then shuffled in the front room to make sure that the windows were all intact. Everything was just as it should have been, so no one had turned up in the wee small hours to throw a brick through my window, which I have no doubt would have woken me up too. And having done all that, I was able to carry on with my morning routine, get ready for work, and leave the house on time. I finished off my morning tea, walked down the hall, opened the door, then after turning to face it in order to close it on my way out, I froze in place. Spray painted on my door, in massive white letters, were the letters PEDO. And I couldn't just leave it. People would be walking past my house all bloody day, and although you couldn't see it clearly from the street, anyone walking right past my gate could see it clear as day. I had to get rid of it, or at least cover it up somehow, so I called into work, told them that I'd be an hour late, then got to work on painting over what I could. And very luckily for me, I'd actually repainted the door just a few weeks prior, so I had some paint left over to cover up the majority of the word. But over the course of half an hour or so it took me to get the job done, more than one person stopped suddenly while walking past my gate, gave me some sort of shocked look, then carried on walking as if though they hadn't seen anything. And those few moments were some of the most mortifying of my entire life. I couldn't run after them shouting, "It's not what it looks like," because in my head, that made it look even more like something it wasn't. All I could do was feel my cheeks burn with embarrassment and hurry up with painting so I could finish up and get going to work. It was throughout the course of that day that I realized the whole incident might not be confined as a sort of one-night thing. I called the police on my lunch break, not 999, but the extension number that I'd been given to talk to one of the officers who dealt with my case. And again, he was really helpful, and gave me an email address that I could forward the CCTV images to. The person who spray-painted my door had their face covered, but having time-stamped images was obviously a huge help to the police. I felt a bit better after that, knowing the law was on my side, and when I got home after work, there was no additional damage or vandalism. I hoped that that'd be the last of it, that it was just some psycho family who'd grown bored of victimizing me in the end. But it didn't end there. There was still a way to go before the story finally ends. Over the course of the next few months, the harassment was almost incessant. Most mornings, I'd wake up to something pushed through my letterbox or eggs splattered all over my door, and those kinds of things were just annoying. Half an hour's cleanup or whatever, and it was over and done with. What I couldn't deal with was the stuff they drew or painted on the house or on the street outside. Stuff that said things like "nunce," "beast," or "a predator lives here." And I learned very quickly that if I wanted to actually get rid of said graffiti, that I had to clean it off myself. The council was very sympathetic in all fairness, and the one time they did get a bloke with a power washer around, but he was very sympathetic. And I remember showing him the graffiti, which in that case said kitty toucher in big letters on my pathway and then instantly getting incredibly defensive.
That'd be great, Jacob.
I offered to show him the CCTV of
drop
me
the
getting
like
spat
button
on,
if you
show
want.
him an email chain where I've been talking to the police. And I know I got a bit emotional because he looked a bit shell-shocked by the time I finished my little rant. But when he told me, "It's all right, man, I believe you. People can be horrible like that." I had to excuse myself upstairs to have a very brief but very intense cry. I know that there were some people who had their suspicions. No smoke without fire, as they say, but that wasn't what broke me in the end. I knew I was innocent, and after a while, the eggings and incidents of vandalism slowly petered out. There was actually a point where I thought that things might get back to normal, but then came that final, fatal Facebook post. It was a uni friend who told me about it, sent me a screenshot via email one afternoon asking me, "Isn't this your place?" It was some kind of predator hunters group. The first I'd heard of anything like that, whereas they're obviously quite notorious these days. Now don't get me wrong, if you're caught banged to rights soliciting that from a kid, then you deserve everything you get. But back in 2011, it seems that it wasn't down to an exact science yet, and a lot of groups were still trafficking in rumors and false allegations. Seeing my house, the place that I'd once been the happiest I'd ever been, plastered in some Facebook group, was this benchmark moment in the whole ordeal. I didn't think that it could get any worse, and then it did. There was some caption attached to the photo, and I can't remember the exact wording because I skim-read everything in this white-hot panic, but it basically suggested that I was going to be the target of a firebombing at some point in the next few weeks. One of the comments said something to the effect of, "Plenty of fireworks still going off this time of year. Be ashamed if one landed on his house or flew through his letterbox." There were plenty more like that too, all calling for violence. Harassment was one thing, but this marked an intolerable escalation. I was no longer safe in my own home, and my dream was over. The same friend who shared the screenshot offered me his couch for as long as I needed it, but if I was going anywhere, I was driving back to my parents. I've been too afraid and ashamed to mention anything to them. I just internalized everything for weeks and weeks on end, and that same tactic had resulted in me hiding that outpouring from the council worker, and it had wreaked havoc on my own mental health. So, that's what I did. I did the one thing I'd never wanted to do from the day I moved away for uni and went running back to my mommy and daddy. I know now that that was the best thing to do. I mean, I was still so young at the time, just about to turn 26, and when I think, what a hell of a thing to go through at such a young age. Now, I won't go into much detail regarding the fallout of telling them what happened, but let's just say that going to live with them again for a bit was exactly what I needed. I was broken. I didn't realize it before I got there, but I was. I was physically, emotionally, and spiritually drained, and by that point, it made sense to just leave and start fresh somewhere else. I won't bore you with everything that came after. The landlord of the house made it impossible to get out of contract, and after a little bit of financial help from my parents and grandparents, for which I am eternally grateful for, I was able to get myself a completely fresh start. And by that point, it was entirely welcome, and as time went on, the trauma subsided and the memories began to fade. Not to say that I've completely forgotten about the whole thing. You never really let stuff like that go, and it always comes back strong every Halloween. But now, I'm happy to say that I've 95% made peace with what happened. I tried for a long time to think of a way to end this, and I haven't thought of a better way than this. My one big takeaway from what happened in the autumn and winter of 2012 is that no matter how bad things seem, there's always a light at the end of the tunnel. I see other people going through terrible things in their lives, and I just want to grab them and say, it's bad now, but it won't always be like this. Everything gets better with time, and you just need to find a way out. And I read a Churchill quote around that time, and one that said, when you're going through hell, keep going. And sometimes I think there's never been a truer word said than that. In October of 1981, 17-year-old Kurt Eugene Sova was a happy-go-lucky high school student in his hometown of Newburgh Heights, Ohio. He was the youngest of 4 boys, worked hard in school, and aside from some run-of-the-mill teenage hijinks, he generally kept himself out of trouble. He was also said to be very popular among his peers and often found himself invited to various parties and get-togethers. Yet it was one of these very gatherings that Kurt met a sudden and horrifying end, one that would send shockwaves through his friends and family, as well as the wider community. On Friday, October 23rd of 1981, Kurt displayed some very unusual behavior. In the company of some friends, he skipped school, headed to a local liquor store, then convinced someone over the age of 21 to buy him a bottle of an extremely potent alcohol beverage named Everclear. Upon obtaining the alcohol, Kurt spent the day at a friend's house where he and several other teenagers became highly intoxicated. The group intended to visit a local Halloween carnival and partook in what might be called pre-gaming today. The idea was to get as drunk as possible before attending the carnival, where alcohol would presumably be expensive. After drinking as much as possible in as short a time as possible, Kurt and his friends began to make their way to the carnival, and on their way, they ran into a mutual friend named Sam Carroll. Sam was on his way to a Halloween party at a duplex on Harvard Avenue and invited Kurt to come along. For some reason, Kurt chose to ditch his first group of friends and followed Sam to the Halloween party instead of heading to the carnival. Sam later said that Kurt was extremely intoxicated when they first met, and drank even more at the Halloween party. Kurt drank so much that he suddenly and violently became ill, and Sam followed him outside while he vomited against a fence. Since the late autumn night was so chilly, Sam claimed that he went back inside to fetch their jackets, but when he stepped outside again, Kurt was gone. Sam also claimed that Kurt's sudden disappearance didn't alarm him, since he figured his booze-sick friend had simply wandered home to sleep it off. But Kurt hadn't wandered home. In fact, Sam Carroll was the last person to see him alive. The following morning, Kurt's mother noticed that he was missing almost immediately. It wasn't like him to be gone overnight, Dorothy Sova told reporters. He always came home at 10 or 10:30 at the latest, so when I walked into his room and saw an empty bed, I got a terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. Dorothy began calling the homes of Kurt's friends, hoping one of them knew of her son's whereabouts. She then enlisted Kurt's father and a handful of their neighbors in scouring the surrounding neighborhood in hopes that someone had seen him. But Kurt was nowhere to be found. And by the early evening of Saturday, October 24th, Kurt's parents still held out a glimmer of hope that their boy would come home, tired, hungover, but safe. Yet the following morning, when Kurt remained missing, his parents contacted the Newburgh Heights police to report him missing. And at first, local law enforcement dismissed the concerns of Kurt's parents. There had been numerous instances of mischief, all stemming from the same booze-filled house party on Harvard Avenue, and since Kurt's parents lived just 2 miles away from the site of the party, officers correctly deduced that their son had been present there. It wasn't unusual for a teenager to spend a day or two away from home following a particularly catastrophic experiment with drugs and alcohol. And with this in mind, police refused to dedicate valuable time and resources to a case that might simply resolve itself over the course of the coming days. Dorothy Sova pleaded with the officers who refused to file her report, assuring them that Kurt was not the type to go missing so suddenly. But her pleas went ignored. It should be noted that one of the police officers who dealt with Dorothy's complaint was later indicted on charges of dereliction of duty, with some charges relating to allegations of gambling and corruption. The officer pled guilty to the charges and was swiftly removed from his position. And in the meantime, Kurt's parents began to conduct their own investigation into their son's disappearance. Dorothy Sova tracked down the officers of the duplex where the party was held, and although they initially denied having seen him, they later admitted to having spotted a heavily intoxicated Kurt wandering the halls alone. Dorothy pressed him on Kurt's whereabouts, but they assured her that they'd been as helpful as possible. As progress slowed, Kurt's parents began to put up missing person flyers around the neighborhood, including inside of several local businesses, and it was this which led to the next major break in the case. One day, a man walked into one of the businesses which had Kurt's flyers pinned to a wall. The clerk on duty noticed that when the man walked past it, he suddenly stopped, turned to look at it, then began to stare intensely at Kurt's face. When the clerk approached the man and asked if anything was wrong, he replied that there was no need for them to display such a flyer. Kurt was dead, and that he would be found in the next few days, and with that, the man tore down the flyer, then walked out of the store. The clerk immediately contacted local law enforcement, who tracked the man down for questioning, but after determining that the man was mentally ill and thus unreliable, he was released without charge. A few days later, one of the duplex's residents informed Dorothy that there was someone sleeping on a cot in the basement of the duplex, and that there was a possibility that it might be Kurt. His father promptly investigated these claims, yet although there were indeed signs that someone had been secretly living in the duplex's basement, there was no evidence that it was Kurt. And finally, on October 28th of 1981, 3 local children were playing near a furniture warehouse when they made a horrifying discovery. Lying in a ravine, just 500 yards from the duplex where the party took place, was a decomposing human corpse. It was lying face up in a shallow pool of water, barefoot, wearing a bright yellow t-shirt that was now stained with mud. They rushed to alert the authorities, and within just a few hours, forensic investigators had confirmed it was the body of the missing Kurt Sova. Kurt's body was transported to the county coroner's office, but following an autopsy, cause of death was unable to be determined. He'd sustained a few minor scrapes and bruises, but there was no obvious signs of trauma that might indicate a homicide, and while his blood alcohol content was a relatively high 0.11, that alone wouldn't have been enough to kill him. In all likelihood, Kurt's death has been some kind of accident, but on further analysis, something had been frighteningly overlooked. The ravine where Kurt's body had been found had already been searched by law enforcement just 24 hours before the discovery. It now seemed quite obvious that someone had dragged Kurt's body to a place they knew had already been searched, in a way to slow down the recovery of his corpse. It was a chillingly deliberate move from someone who, for some reason, believed it was in their interest to hide Kurt's body instead of revealing its location. This might not necessarily be someone who killed Kurt, not on purpose anyway, but most certainly someone the police would have been very interested in talking to. As of 2019, the case had been reopened by the Newburgh Heights Police Department, who've enlisted the students from Tiffin University's Criminology Department to help reconstruct elements of the crime. These efforts were continued the following year when Kurt's case was selected for CrimeCon's CrowdSolve event, an exclusive interactive experience where true crime fans and amateur detectives alike examine case files and explore new theories. While both efforts generated new ideas and some potential leads, the mystery behind Kurt's untimely death remains unsolved. Kurt's death might well have been a tragic accident, the result of overconsumption of alcohol coupled with frigid autumnal temperatures. But until the police track down the person who attempted to hide his body, we'll never really know what happened to Kurt that night, or how an uncertain chain of events led to his sudden and frightening demise. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST, and super fun live streams on Sundays, Tuesdays, and Thursday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, don't forget to take a spooky dookie. Most of my friends couldn't even leave their yard without an adult going along. I can only assume that's how everyone in the family grew up, and my parents didn't see anything wrong or dangerous in it. The night was a perfect one for hide and seek. The temperature had yet to grow cold, and there hadn't been any rain in several weeks. I gathered all the boys in a circle and laid out the boundaries and rules for the game. A few of them had stayed over the night before, so they were pretty familiar with the area. I guess at this point I should mention that our house stood across the road from an old 19th century cemetery used by the surrounding farm families. It was used all the way up until the 1960s when they ran out of space to bury the dead. I'd grown up next to it, so I wasn't scared to play there, but when I mentioned that it was inside the hiding boundaries, a couple of the boys got kind of freaked out. I assured them the place wasn't haunted, and only after a lot of coaxing and a small bit of shaming, I convinced them to play. We played a few quick games of rock, paper, scissors until we had our seeker and began the game. Me and another boy ran straight for the cemetery and found their hiding places. I'm not sure where the others went. Once the seeker finished counting, he started the search. 2 or 3 made it to the tree that served as a home base pretty fast. We in the cemetery were the last 2 left. The seeker was soon combing the cemetery for us. The boy that had hidden there with me blew past the kids seeking and made it home untouched. I tried to do the same thing, but the boy was ready this time, and I became it. The game started again, and when I finished counting, I headed to the most used hiding spots first. I did have an obvious advantage, but lack of a moon made seeing in the dark very difficult. A few boys got past me within the first minute. You know, the ones that hide so close to the home base they can almost touch it. There's always 1 or 2 of those in the game, but the remaining 2 were hidden really well. What seemed like 10 minutes or so later, I still hadn't found them, and I was beginning to get sick of looking. Right before I was about to give up, my best friend Troy popped up from under a rotten log on the edge of the cemetery and made a break for home. The hiding place he was in forced him to run away from the road and deeper into the cemetery. Then he cut back towards the road, bringing him dangerously close to me, but I missed him as he passed. We were both running our fastest, however, I was just a bit quicker and right on his tail. All he had to do was make it across the narrow road and the 6 or so feet to the tree and he was home free. We were perhaps just a little less than halfway across when this old blue and gray truck came barreling down the road. It was so close by the time I first saw it, I could have reached out and touched it. Maybe not, but darn near it. I did the only thing I could think of doing and threw my body against Troy's in the hopes I could knock him out of the path of the truck. I don't remember being worried about my stealth, just him. He was my best friend after all, and I'd known him as long as I could remember
Hey,
anything.
welcome back, Steppy Poo.
I slammed shoulder first into the ditch, and it hurt like a mother. Almost positive the truck had run him over, I looked just in time to see
This
Troy
is Space
rolling
Marines
toward me.
2.
Miraculously, he was okay other than a few scrapes and a little road rash. I pounced on him and checked for any signs that he had been hit, but found none. My hands were shaking, and I felt like I was about to barf, but so relieved I started chuckling like a lunatic. I looked up the road and the truck was nowhere to be seen. This wasn't scary as much as confusing. It was after 10 o'clock at
Oh,
night,
really?
and a truck I'd never seen came barreling out of nowhere.
Well,
down
I'm
a
gonna
road that saw
log out
maybe
and
2 or
listen
3
to hear
cars
them
during the
pretty
course of the
soon, I
day,
guess.
and very
I
rarely
think
after
might
dark.
play Call of Duty for a spell.
It
I'm
sent a shiver through my body, but
watch a movie
really
or
began
something.
to trouble me until much later. I helped Troy up, and we did
Something
our best
like
to
that.
shake the near miss off.
That's good. It went
The
well,
other boys
huh?
were in utter disbelief that we'd survived and kept asking us if we were okay. I was a tad sore, and I imagined Troy was about the same. Some of the boys were scared. I could tell by their expressions that they may start crying any minute. This was the last thing I wanted to happen. I repeatedly assured them that we were completely fine and there was no need to be upset. In a few minutes, they began to calm down. I made all the boys promise not to tell anyone, but especially not my parents, what had happened. My biggest fear was that I wouldn't be able to play outside after dark anymore.
That's
Also,
good.
if the other guys' folks heard about it, they may not let them stay the weekend anymore. I barely had any friends as it was. The game was over for the night after that, and it was getting close to 11 anyway, so I called it. We returned to the house and played games until it was time to go to sleep. The remainder of the holiday, we spent our time building a fort in the woods behind the cemetery. That ended up being the last game of hide and seek for the year.
Alright.
Soon after the 1st of November, fall finally began in full. As we grew older, the weekends at the farm became fewer and fewer. A few of the boys there that night got other friends, and one boy, Nicholas, lost his life after his car was struck by a train at an unmarked crossing. Despite this, I look back at those days with an endless happiness. I still talk to Troy about it once a month. He's currently stationed at Fort Hood in Texas with his beautiful wife and 2 daughters. We never fail to laugh at how close we came to getting killed that night, only to be overtaken by confusion and fear surrounding the circumstances in which it happened. As for me, I'm in the process of moving back to the farm with my new wife. My dad and I have been building us a new home a few acres away from the old one and hope to soon be moving in. I moved into town right out of school because I've been offered a job at one of the manufacturing places and stayed there until a month or 2 ago when I began my own business working out of the house. I told my wife many times how fun it was growing up there, and we agreed there isn't any other place we'd want our kids to grow up in. Seeing as Halloween is coming up soon, I want to wish everybody a happy holidays.
Alright, we're gonna go
not
back to
just
Call of
Halloween.
Duty.
Don't forget the night
Cat
is
did
really
something
for the
to the
kids.
computer, I don't know what
Let them
she
have as
did.
much fun as possible while they still can. And one more thing.
Tab's
Please don't
not
forget to
working
remind them
correctly
to look
because
both
Pete
ways
did
when
something
crossing the
to him.
street. Not just when they're trick-or-treating. It should really apply to the rest of the time, too. I'm not sure if I ever told anyone this story before, but I thought since the Halloween holiday is arriving soon, I'd share this strange but sad thing that happened to me as a younger man. At the time the story takes place, I was living alone in a small house next to a city park. Back then I had this cute little dachshund named Oliver, and I would walk him a couple of times a day in the park. On one morning walk, Oliver befriended a fat golden retriever named Buddy. Buddy's owner turned out to be an older gentleman that lived in the house on the other side of the park. His house was roughly 75 yards or so from mine, and although we'd wave a hello at each other once in a while, I never got a clear look at his face. As Oliver and Buddy wrestled around a few feet away, Fred, the neighbor, and I shot the breeze and whatnot. I found out that he and his wife had brought their house back from before the park
I'm gonna
had been
see if I can
created, or
find it.
even any of the houses on the other side of it, including mine, had been built. Back then, all of that land had just
I'm not
been
gonna play
open
it or
prairie.
anything, but
Occasionally, kids in the neighborhood would ride their dirt bikes there, but that was about it. We talked a few more minutes, and then I had to split and go to work. After that, we would run into each other in the park once in a while and sit and share stories while the doggos played with each other. A few times a year, he and his wife would have neighbors over for burgers and hot dogs. Oliver and I would attend every time we could. In the short time I was living there, Fred and I became good friends, and I never saw him as anything less than a genuinely
That's
cool
fine,
old
fine,
man
okay.
who could tell great jokes. When fall came around, I took a second job to ensure that I could keep paying my bills. My regular job was laying concrete for driveways and sidewalks, and during the colder and rainier parts of the year, we worked a lot less. The new job had me working at night, so I started seeing Fred less and less.
Can't lay right in the middle of everything. I'm gonna have to reboot. Sorry guys, I'll be right back. This cat just messed this computer up. I don't know what she did. I'll be right back.